Welcome to the Celestial Saga channel. We thought the gods were immortal until we saw them die. What killed them? Watch to find out the truth. What does it mean for a being to be all-powerful, all-knowing, immortal? Or so we believed. I was there, standing at the very moment when we learned that even the gods could die now. I find myself in front of the cave's mouth, staring down into the dark void that stretches endlessly within. I take in deep breaths through my scorched gills, my beak fractured, my hooves split, and my tentacles stained with the familiar blood. Everything around me is dead and decayed. There are no plants, no signs of life, nothing even remotely resembling nature. The air is stagnant, and every breath I take feels like I'm choking. I'm surrounded by the remnants of Walter Darnell's past. Huge cyclopean towers that once scraped the very sky, now half collapsed. Hollow shells like skeletons picked clean by scavengers, bleached by the harsh sun. I despise the sight before me, but even more than that, I fear what lies hidden within the cave. Still, I press forward, stepping deeper into its gaping mouth. I cross the last glimmer of light that barely touches the floor and light a torch I hadn't even noticed in my hand. The flame flickers, casting shadows on the ancient cave walls, illuminating the cracks and jagged edges where twisted rebar juts out, severed cables hanging loosely, and shattered glass crunching underfoot. I've been here before countless times. I know every turn, every step, each passage leading to the central chamber where my ancestors once gathered. With each meter I move, the weight of the earth and the old stone above me presses down harder. The air grows thicker, heavier, and the light from my torch dims little by little. My heartbeat quickens, my gills flare, and every instinct within me screams to turn back, to return to the light, to the fresh air, to the safety of the outside world. Yet as with every other time, I cannot resist the pull of the darkness. I move forward. I pass through what was once a door, now just a frame, and find myself in the vast, hollow rotunda. The narrow corridors I had traversed felt claustrophobic, but this cavernous room overwhelms me. The oppressive emptiness makes me feel smaller, insignificant. Still, I push forward, as I have done so many times before, until I stand before the mural, the one that has called to me from the depths of this cave. It's a depiction of them, the star gods, the Galia, the Varijao beings of radiant light, all-knowing, all-powerful, immortal. The light from my torch dances on the surface of the mural, breathing life into its every detail, every color. The painting shows their arrival on Galia, descending from beyond the sea of stars, riding on great metal beasts that breathed fire and thunder. The night sky had turned bright as day as their beasts streaked across the heavens, and looking lower down the mural, I see their figures painted in gold and silver. They commanded the very skies above, sending down pure light upon the cities from towering structures made of iron and stone, reaching so high they seemed to scrape the clouds. But the towers are now ruins, piles of ash and green-tinged glass. The star gods had turned mountains to rubble, boiled the seas, and turned forests into barren deserts. Our planet was theirs to mold, like wet clay in the hands of a sculptor. The fresco is magnificent, a true masterpiece, every stroke of the brush a work of art. But something catches my eye. Something hidden in the corner of the mural, almost entirely faded away. I can barely make out the outline of dark figures lurking just outside the painting's frame. A glance in their direction fills me with an overwhelming sense of dread, as though I'm sinking into a pit of mud. Yet, I cannot help myself. I step closer, my steps slow and drawn toward the figures. As I get closer, the light of my torch grows weaker. It's as if the painting itself resents being seen, swallowing all the light, pulling it into a vortex, leaving me with only darkness. And I cannot resist with each step. I feel myself sinking deeper, as though the very air is pulling me under. I reach out, hand trembling to touch the wall, and then I wake up. I hear Wesley Tilden's voice echo in the room, and the mural fades away. The stone walls crumble into nothingness, and reality replaces it. When I open my eyes, I'm no longer in that ancient hall. I'm in the mind that has been my home for the past 4 years. The flickering light of a lantern casts a faint glow on Wesley Tilden's face, making him appear as though he too has just emerged from the dream with me. "It's time we leave. The others are on watch," he says. Without a word, I gather my gear, preparing to go. "You saw your dream again?" Wesley Tilden asks. I nod, the vision still vivid in my mind. "I saw it too," he continues. I was there again in HFY Square, surrounded by a sea of screaming guans. Their voices were a wall of noise, all pure fury and hatred. The statue of the Holy Descent cast a long shadow over us, and I could feel the eyes of the first star god staring down, as if they were trying to peer into my very soul. I felt tiny in their presence, like I was about to be crushed by the weight of marble and gold. That's when I heard the Inquisitor's voice, booming through 100 voice casters, calling for the heretic to be brought forth. Suddenly, the shrieks of 20,000 fanatics silenced, every one of them. I could hear each step the heretic took as he ascended the scaffold. I could even hear him struggling to breathe, the air rasping through his swollen, beaten gills. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize him. He was a twisted shell of what he once was. His skin hung loosely over bones that had been shattered and hastily mended. Scorch marks, where white-hot iron had been pressed against him, marred his body. And his eyes, what had once been eyes, were now just bloodied, empty sockets. A fitting punishment for a heretic, right? I watched him take his place on the pyre, the one the executioner had prepared specifically for him. Just before the headsman's torch ignited the kindling at my father's feet, I saw him look at me. Those empty eye sockets seemed to see right through me, and then, with a voice that echoed in my mind, he commanded, "Summon the turn." And just like that, he was consumed by flames. The crowd erupted, and I woke up with my heart racing, threatening to burst from my chest. Wesley Tilden paused for a moment, reflecting. "It's kind of funny," he said. "It doesn't feel like a dream. It feels more vivid than any real memory I have." I couldn't help but agree. I was still an egg, waiting to hatch, when my father was executed. I've never seen the statue of the first star god up close, never even been to HFY Square. Wesley Tilden had shared his recurring dream with me before. It's how we met. It's how he recruited me into the Remembrancers, an order that, as he explained it, had shared this kind of recurring dream. We called them dreams. But in truth, they were more like visions. They'd visit us every time we closed our eyes and lingered in our minds. Even when they were wide open, I hated this. Though Delilah Gray's voice broke my thoughts, this feeling, every time I see it, it's the sense that you know you have to do something, but you don't know exactly what. It gnaws at you. I understood I hated that feeling too. It's like a fading memory that slips through your fingers just as you think you have a hold on it. We remember that we should follow our visions, but we forget how or why. That's how the Remembrancers came to be, helping each other remember, helping each other figure out what needed to be done to scratch that itch that always seemed just beyond reach. I ducked out of the small entryway to the bunk room where I had been sleeping and into the corridors that twisted through the mine. They connected the various shafts and living quarters. The walls, where the soil was solid enough for nails to stick, were covered in religious iconography. The descending star, the emblem of the star gods, was marked every few meters. In between, there were etchings and paintings of excerpts from the Tayir Akum, the words from above. A particularly common one read, "Toil for those above, and find joy down below." I never liked that one. Every time I saw it, it stirred something foul inside me. A distinct and inexplicable disgust for those words filled me. The clergy said the gods had freed us from our ignorance. They took away our sinful creations, the very things that fueled our desires, and blessed us with the gift of piety and submission. They showed us our place in the dirt so we could better appreciate the glory of the stars. Back then, I still wondered if maybe I would understand the wisdom in their preaching. But all I could think about was that, at least when we created those sinful things, we did it for ourselves. At least when we worked ourselves to the bone, it wasn't to pay a tithe to gods who resided in their forbidden cities, high in their white mountains. At least when our young hatched, we didn't offer a tenth of their number to the gods, never to see them again. Meal and I passed by a pair of overseers prowling the corridors, looking for workers who should have been toiling for those above but were slacking off instead. The still wet blood at the ends of their whips told the story of those they'd caught. Luckily, we managed to pass by them without being stopped. The passes we carried might have borne the true seal of the head overseer, a seal that was bought with a handful of silver coins slid under the table, but I was always grateful to avoid an encounter with an overseer. The scars on my back ached whenever I saw their masks, engraved with scrolls that served as their badges of office. Finally, we reached the water-powered elevator and caught a gondola to the surface. Delilah Gray decided it was safe to chat again. "What do you think of this person, Michael Prescott? Is he one of us, or just another fool trying to get himself killed by entering the city of glass?" she asked, as if she hadn't just been waiting for an excuse to share her thoughts. He said he's had visions, repeated dreams of his entrance into the city. Each night, the dreams aided him more. He says that it's only when he began his journey toward the city that he finally felt calm. That's how he knew he needed to go there, I explained. Yeah, I know, I read the letter too, Delilah Gray replied. But he could just be a scavenger, trying to plunder ancient artifacts from the city's ruins. When he got caught, he spun this tale of dreams and visions so that the Watchers would think he's crazy and let him go. But right now, what matters is whether the remembrancers at the well think his story is true. As the elevator reached the surface, the orange light of the setting sun hit our eyes. I almost smiled at the sight, but the scent of charred flesh quickly replaced the pleasant image. Too many burned heretics, too many to protect the clergy. They tortured and burned them, hoping to instill fear of the star gods in those who strayed from their teachings. But every corpse turned to charcoal only served as another sign of defiance against them. Heresy, blasphemy, criminality of all kinds. It felt like the entire world was churning in those days, like the people could sense a coming change deep in their gut. Now that I thought about it, maybe they could. As I took my first steps outside, I realized I couldn't even remember the last time I had set foot beyond the mine. My dreams drove me to act, but they never told me what action to take. So I threw myself into my work. When my tentacles were blistered and bleeding from the pickaxe, it hurt. But at least it gave me a brief reprieve from that constant, ever-present need to go somewhere I wasn't even sure of. Every moment I wasn't working felt like torture. But this time, it felt different. This time, it felt right, as if I was finally doing what I was meant to do. That was all the confirmation I needed to believe that Michael Prescott was telling the truth. The air outside the mine felt fresh, but heavy with humidity, and I could sense a storm brewing just beyond the horizon. It was the same horizon we were heading toward. It was a long walk to the prison where Michael Prescott was being held, but just knowing I was getting a step closer to following the vision that had consumed my mind all this time was all the motivation I needed. A few hours later, the storm clouds that had threatened to rain down upon us finally did, turning the ground into a sticky mess of mud up to our knees by the time we spotted the prison's watchtowers glistening faintly under the dim moonlight breaking through the thick clouds. Wesley Tilden had arranged for the guards to leave the steel bars open, allowing access to the spillway where the prisoners' sewage flowed into the nearby river. But the storm had swollen the river, pushing its waters above the spillway. To reach our target, we would have to dive into the icy current. We began to shed our outer cloaks when suddenly, a thunderous crash split the sky, and a blinding light engulfed us in the prison. For a moment, I thought I had been struck by lightning. It was Wesley Tilden's confused expression that snapped me out of it. We both looked upward, where the deafening sound and blinding light had come from. That's when we saw it, one of their beasts, descending into the prison courtyard. I had seen them in the mural from my dreams, but the painting didn't do them justice. The beast's metal body shone as if it were made from the purest silver, and it was larger than any house I had ever seen. From its 4 mouths poured fire, furious and relentless, flooding the courtyard below. It spun, revealing 2 glowing red eyes, scanning the area like a predator searching for prey. I was still transfixed by the sight when I felt Wesley Tilden pull me by the cloak and into the freezing river. We plunged beneath the surface just as the beast's red gaze swept over the water above us. I realized in that moment that Wesley Tilden had just saved my life. Without missing a beat, he pointed toward the spillway, and we began to swim toward it. The water was frigid, numbing every part of me as we fought our way through the current. Finally, we passed the spillway and reached the cistern beneath the prison. Wesley Tilden emerged first, and I followed. My body trembled with exhaustion, and it took everything I had to drag myself in my soaking cloak out of the water. By the time I stopped shaking, Wesley Tilden had already started a fire, using debris gathered from the cistern's banks. The ones who take up arms against them are cut down like grain in the harvest, he said. Their arms are turned to dust, their tentacles wilt and fall away like ripe fruit from the tree. He was reciting a passage from the Word from above, something he had done 1,000 times before in his past life as a member of the clergy. Before his dreams started, before he joined the Remembrancers, he had been a preacher. He paused, looking me over as though to make a point. "Do you think your soul is pure enough?" he asked. We waited. We listened to the distorted voices of the Geans, trapped in the pipes leading to the cistern. Their words were muffled, full of desperation. We heard prayers to the star gods cut off abruptly, followed by the agonizing screams of Geans, their cries chilling my very blood. Then the familiar smell reached us, the scent of flesh engulfed by flames. It was a smell I knew well. We didn't spend more than a few moments in that place, yet it felt as though we had been there for days, surrounded by the wails of the suffering and the stench of burned skin. We waited, listening to the roar of the star god's beast fading into the distance, until even the screams above us fell silent. Finally, we moved out of the cistern through the grates that ran beneath the prison's basement. What we saw there was a horror beyond anything we had witnessed before, a more real, more profound terror than I could have imagined. The smell of incinerated flesh and boiled blood was overwhelming, stronger than it had been in the cistern, drowning all other senses except sight. The walls of the cells were black with soot, and the bars still glowed red from the heat. The floor was littered with broken, blackened corpses. Those whose faces hadn't been completely burned were contorted in the agony of their final moments. The world was silent as we moved through that sea of death. We were like ghosts, each of us focused solely on our purpose. We had to find Michael Prescott, make him lead us to his passage in the City of Glass, to fulfill the visions that had haunted us. We searched the corridors, passing through the mangled remains until a faint whisper broke the silence, a cry from one of the isolation cells. We followed the sound, our steps hesitant, until we found him. Michael Prescott, lying in a pool of his own blood. His face was a charred mess of red, blistered skin, and where his eyes had once been were only empty, melted sockets. But his beak still moved, and strangely, the words he uttered were curled. In an expression of bliss, instead of suffering, we moved closer, and that's when we realized what we had heard wasn't a cry. It was a faint laugh. Michael Prescott was laughing. "They will come, the turn will come, and your world will burn," he said, his voice barely a whisper, more fragile than the faintest breeze. With his last breath, he exhaled those words. Above him, where the wall wasn't blackened with scorch marks, we saw the drawings. An elaborate map to the City of Glass covered the cell's walls from floor to ceiling. We both stared at the map for what felt like an eternity, until I finally spoke. "Where did you say he was caught?" I asked. Wesley Tilden answered, "The eastern passage to the city, parallel to the Red Road." I tapped the wall, drawing attention to the map. "This map shows an entrance from the west." I sat down, rummaging through my satchel, until I found a piece of charcoal and some paper. The eastern passage is heavily patrolled. The western passage is almost abandoned because it's cursed by the star gods. It's said to be impossible to enter the city alive through there. Anyone who tries ends up vomiting and bleeding from every orifice. But this map shows an underground passage. Maybe that's safe. Maybe it hasn't been touched by the curse, I remarked as I carefully recreated the map on the paper. Wesley Tilden took a step back. "He wanted to be caught," he said. "His dreams told him to be caught, to make this for us." He paused and then added, "Finish the drawing and make sure it's accurate. It's time we visit the well." It was a 3-day walk from the prison to Zalath, the blessed city, where our chapter house was located. I had only visited once before, but it didn't take me long to understand where its name came from. The well, an abandoned cistern in a part of the Zalath sewers that had been out of use for decades, replaced by newer infrastructure, was where the remembrancers gathered. It smelled and felt exactly as you'd expect an abandoned sewer to feel. Damp, old, with the scent of centuries of sewage still clinging to the stones. Bookshelves, workstations, bedding, and a cooking area with an open spit marked this hall as a living space. The faces around me were unfamiliar. I had been part of the society for years, but Wesley Tilden was the only other remembrancer I truly knew. The things we were investigating, the things we were doing to follow the dreams that invaded our minds, were considered blasphemy by the clergy. It seemed even the star gods themselves were opposed to us. That meant we had to be careful, had to follow certain rules. One of them was to only work in pairs. The less we knew about each other, the safer we were. Wesley Tilden led me through the cistern chapter house, past a cramped office that had once been a maintenance storage room. The office was now crammed with shelves, old chests, and scattered books. Some of the books had slipped from their decaying covers and spilled onto the floor. Above us, an ancient chandelier illuminated the room with an otherworldly glow. There were no strings or pulleys to raise or lower it. This chandelier didn't need candles to shine. Instead, it produced light from 8 small orbs of orange glass that burned without heat. How it worked was beyond anyone's understanding, and its mere existence was enough to condemn everyone in the well to death if discovered. I stared at the chandelier, mesmerized like a child seeing fireworks for the first time. Then, the rusty click of a lock behind me snapped me out of my awe. My first thought was that Wesley Tilden had led me here to trap me. Perhaps I had seen too much, heard too much, and now the remembrancers wanted me dead. Being part of a secret society, hiding in the shadows, does tend to make you paranoid. Do you know where your dreams come from? I heard a voice from the darkness where the chandelier's light couldn't reach. No, I replied, my voice echoing slightly in the dim room. The figure emerged from the shadows. We used to be more before the gods arrived, he said. We used to reach for the stars ourselves before our tentacles were cut off. The figure stepped into the light, revealing himself. You don't know me, but I know you. I'm the one who's been coordinating your group, Quadrille and the rest. You're the Grandmaster? I asked, surprised. Some call me that, he answered. Though I despise the term, I'm nobody's master. He paused, as though trying to judge me to see if I was worthy of his trust. Come on, he finally said, gesturing for me to follow. We moved through a narrow passage between two bookshelves and found ourselves atop a winding metal staircase lit by torches. Between the torches, cables snaked along the walls, just like the ones I had seen in my dreams. The walls around us were made of concrete instead of stone. It didn't take long to realize that this section of the sewers was much older than the rest, several hundred, maybe even 1,000 years old. It predated the descent of the star gods. At the bottom of the staircase was a vault door made of a massive iron slab, resting on hinges bigger than my torso. The Grandmaster took a key from his cloak and slid it into the lock. The door opened on its own with no system of ropes or pulleys in sight. Beyond the door was a device that I could hardly even begin to describe. A myriad of cables seemed to sprout from it like weeds, clinging to the ceiling and sprawling across the floor beneath us. It's long been dormant, the Grandmaster explained, gesturing to the device. Now it's simply an elaborate artifact, but our ancestors called it the Dreamcaster. He sighed, his voice tinged with a mix of regret and nostalgia. There was a time when we sought to find life beyond the sea of stars, a time before life came and found us. We used this device, along with others like it, to reach out to them, whoever would listen. We found that while language might have its limitations, the subconscious of any intelligent species could be affected in much the same way by something called a quantum wave. The messages carried by these waves weren't always clear. They were often fragmented across multiple recipients and nearly impossible to direct at a single individual. But they could be received and interpreted by anyone across the sea of stars. The message carried by these waves was a dream, just like the ones you've been having, like the ones all of us here have been experiencing and following. So, are our dreams someone else's doing? Have they been sending them to us? I asked. Another group? A species from beyond the sea of stars? I inquired. Boris Albright, he answered. The Turn. They've been sending us messages for centuries. There are records of Geans having dreams like ours for hundreds of years all across Gea. And after all this time, we've finally managed to interpret them. What do they want? I asked. Even though a part of me already knew. They wanted to come here, to finish what they had started millennia ago. They sought to hunt down the star gods and destroy them. The Grandmaster nodded silently, as if reading my mind, or more likely, sharing the same thought. I wanted you to know the truth about what we're really doing here, he said. I wanted to give you the chance to turn back if you wanted. I thought of all the burned heretics tied to stakes, the overseers massacring entire villages to root out a single blasphemer. I thought of all the lashings I had received. I thought of the atrocities committed in the name of those who came from the stars. I thought of my son, my only son, whom I'd been forced to offer as a sacrifice to the star gods. I didn't need to think any longer. Good, Brielle Oak said, seeing the answer written in my eyes before I could speak. With the map, we have all the pieces we need to call the turn. We'll head out in a fortnight. From afar, the city of glass looked less like a city and more like a geological formation. What were once buildings now resembled enormous stone pillars or natural obelisks reaching toward the sky like 1,000 outstretched tentacles begging for salvation from the heavens. The sun streamed through the gaps between them, casting long shadows that stretched for kilometers, eventually reaching us. 5 of us stood there, those whose dreams had led them to this city, each of us with a role to play in the final moments before we changed the world forever. Wesley Tilden, whose purpose was to summon the turn. Valiel Park, who was to enter a sequence of numbers into an ancient machine. Del Harmon, who had the recurring dream of lighting a fire hot enough to burn the wings of an angel, the Grandmaster, who saw what came after, and myself, tasked with guiding us to the ancient cave. We followed Michael Prescott's map as best as we could, trying to be as discreet as possible. We traveled only under the cover of night, never lighting a fire or a torch, even after we passed through the last village and entered the desolate no-man's land surrounding the city. No villages, no traders, not even nature dared to trespass here. All that lay before us was a barren ring of black soil, emptiness, and scattered ruins that stretched to the horizon and marked the perimeter of the city. "There," Vishal Park said, pointing. "The entrance to the underground passage." Indeed, the markings on the map matched what we saw, an inky hole in the ground, surrounded by crumbling buildings built by our ancestors, their purposes now long forgotten. We marched into the murky depths of the hole, stepping cautiously into a tunnel where, for the first time, we felt safe enough to light our torches. In their dim glow, we saw marvels of our past that no Jian had seen for generations. The ceiling was lined with glass similar to the one on the Grandmaster's chandelier, though these had long since lost their heatless flame. Between them were blades encased in metallic drums with holes at either end. Strings of metal hung loosely between them, connecting the drums. The walls of the tunnel resembled the cave in my dream, marked by fissures in the concrete. Yet something inside me knew this wasn't the same place. I still had a journey ahead. Scattered around us were the metallic skeletons of ancient beasts. They bore a slight resemblance to the beasts the star gods rode, but they were tiny in comparison, far less intimidating. They even felt familiar, as if these beasts were made to be ridden by Jians, not star gods. When we emerged from the tunnel, we saw why they called it the City of Glass. The ground was paved with a layer of green glass that cracked with every step we took. Enormous piles of melted glass stood where buildings once had been, now resembling giant furnaces, as if they were ready to burst open and unleash millions of those dreadful insects. Just the thought of it sent a shiver down my spine, yet they remained dormant as we walked among them. The unease never left me, though. I knew I was walking on forbidden ground, that each breath I took here was an act of blasphemy, worthy of death, a death that seemed imminent. Any building that hadn't turned to glass was made of metal and stone, hollow and looming over us, like we were nothing more than insects. Between the glass mounds and the hollowed-out buildings of Jia's past, there stood a hill, its crest adorned with cyclopean metallic structures. "The map ends here," Brielle Oakes said, looking up from the copy she held in her tentacles. "Now what?" she asked. Before the Grandmaster could answer, I stepped forward. "I know where we must go," I said. I could feel something guiding me, pulling me toward the hill at the center of the city and the cave that crowned it. The pull from my dreams had become a physical sensation, and now it was present in my waking life too. I was getting close. The end was near. We reached the foot of the hill when Brielle Oakes noticed it, a winged shadow in the moonlight. Before she could say or do anything about it, the creature from the sky was already diving toward us with a screech. In the blink of an eye, the creature had snatched Vishal Park in its iron talons and was taking him to the sky. His screams faded as it climbed higher, and for a brief moment there was silence. The silence didn't last long. The screams returned, growing louder and louder as we watched him plummet from the sky, his entrails trailing behind him. He crashed into one of the shorter piles of green glass, cracking it on impact. Then came the creature's screech, deafening and furious. We pulled out our crossbows, ready to strike when it came into view. The four of us who remained fired, but every bolt missed completely. As I struggled to reload, I heard a crash followed by the sickening sound of flesh and bone being crushed behind me. I turned to face it. At the creature's feet, I saw the shattered corpse of Wesley Tilden. I froze, my limbs locking up as if made of rusted iron. In the moonlight I saw it, a creature that was a grotesque mockery of the Jian form. The beast had the body and head of a Galen, but its muscles rippled unnaturally, tearing through its skin, exposing raw tissue beneath. Metal wires coiled around its head, and metal plates were embedded in it. Yet beneath it all was the face of a small Jian child, not even a juvenile. It was then that I realized what I was looking at, an angel, an abomination, the result of merging a Jian child, sacrificed to the star gods, with their arcane mechanical constructs. Its limbs were iron and wire, grotesquely fused with flesh as if tumors were bursting through sickly skin. Two massive iron wings stretched from its back, each feather ending in a razor-sharp tip. I saw one of the angel's taloned arms rise to strike me, but before it could, a bolt struck it in the back of the head. The creature spun around, its attention shifting to Brielle Oakes, who had fired the bolt. She was standing atop the skeleton of a metal beast when the angel lunged at her. In a single swipe of its wings, it cleaved Brielle Oakes in half, severing her at the waist. But it was already too late. The beast's skeleton exploded with deafening force beneath the angel's feet, consuming the creature in flames. It screeched and thrashed wildly as the fire burned it. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the screeching stopped, leaving only the sound of a young Jian boy's scream. The screaming too faded, and the angel dropped to the ground, its wings melting into pools of liquid iron. With the last of the noise gone, a faint groan came from the pile of glass where Vajal Park had fallen. The Grandmaster and I ran toward it, climbing to the top. There, we found Vajal Park still clinging to life, though barely. With the last of his strength, he pointed to his chest before exhaling his final breath. Above the gaping wound where the angel had disemboweled him, a sequence of numbers was drawn in blood, the same numbers he had been seeing in his dreams. Even in his last moments, he had helped us. We didn't have time to mourn him. Fearing more angels would come, we made a run for the top of the hill. Amidst the rubble and rusted metal structures, we found the entrance to the cave I had dreamed of. On top of it, I saw an emblem of a constellation of stars, and beneath it, ancient Jian writing that read, "Center for Stellar Observation." I was ready to enter when the Grandmaster stopped me. I turned to see him, bloodied from the chest down. A piece of shrapnel had struck him during the battle with the angel. "I had hoped I would get to see it with my own eyes," he said, collapsing to his knees. "But I guess dreams will have to do." He whispered, "My dream is that even gods may die," and handed me an ancient key. The key bore the same emblem as the one above the cave's entrance. The cave was exactly as I had dreamt it. Broken glass beneath my feet, loose severed wires, cracked concrete. At the end of the tunnel, there was a great hall, and on its walls, a mural. I ran my fingers across its surface, walking toward its familiar dark corner. As I neared, my torch grew dimmer, just as it had in my dreams. Something seemed to be swallowing its light. When I reached the corner, the darkness didn't greet me as I expected. Instead, I saw the figures that resided in the shadows. I saw the turn, beings dressed in black and cloaked in shadow. In the mural, they held an entire planet in their grasp, cracking it apart between their fingers. From the shattered planet, countless star gods' beasts spilled into the sea beyond the stars. It was then that I realized the star gods, our masters, were nothing more than prey, and those beings in the shadows, the turn, were predators. I sat there in the darkness, contemplating what to do next. "Even the gods may die," I heard the Grandmaster's voice echo in the black. Slowly, I stood, reigniting my torch. I moved with a certainty I didn't know I had, walking through the adjacent room marked Signal Center. Inside, I found a console pulsating with light. Somehow, the ancient technology of my ancestors still powered it. I slid the Grandmaster's key into the slot at the top of the console and turned it, unlocking it like a key to a lock. On the number board, I pressed the numbers I had seen on Vajal Park's chest. I paused for a final moment before the end, before I brought my dream to reality. I pressed a button labeled Begin Transmission, then stepped back as the walls began to hum with buzzing light. I'm not sure how long I stood there, watching the flickering screens, unsure of their purpose. When I finally found myself outside again, it was dawn, and a swarm of the star gods' metal beasts filled the sky. The beasts hovered in the air, flames shooting from their mouths. A blinding light flashed before my eyes, bringing me to my knees. Bathed in that light, I saw a being of radiant power emerge. The moment it appeared, I felt the very fabric of my sanity begin to unravel. With a booming voice that rattled my bones, I heard words filled with desperation, an emotion that seemed impossible for such a being to express. "What have you done?" the star god demanded, its voice cracking at the end. Suddenly, all color drained from the sky above. The blackness swallowed the flickering stars that had lingered in the moments before the sun revealed itself. The orange glow that painted the eastern horizon and the light blue at its edge were consumed, devoured by the non-existence that had eaten away the heavens. And then I saw it. A beast, a dragon, larger than any of the star god's creations. As suddenly as the sky had vanished, it returned. And with the return of the color came a shockwave, a roar like 1,000 volcanoes erupting at once. The explosion shattered the green glass beneath me, causing the glass mounds to explode into infinite pieces. I instinctively closed my eyes, and when I opened them again, I saw more than half of the star god's beasts plummet from the sky, their bodies aflame. The rest fled, scattering in terror from the metal dragon that had emerged from nothingness. But even as the beast retreated, the two that remained were set aflame, one by one, as the turn dragon unleashed bolts of light upon them. The star god looked upward, and though I couldn't read its expression, I could sense that what it felt was nothing short of absolute horror. I saw it take a step back, producing a small device from its waist. It pressed it to its head, and in that instant the god collapsed, dead. What kind of being could wield such power? The power to kill gods with nothing but its existence. Amidst the pooling blood of the fallen god at my feet, surrounded by the burning carcasses of the beasts, I heard the voice of the Turn. "This is the Ion Lightbringer. The Imperium of Terra has come for you. Be not afraid.